So today's daf is daf samach beis, and we're trying to figure out why is it that the mizbeach during Bayis Sheni was larger than the mizbeach during Bayis Rishon. I mean, after all, the total number of people who came to Eretz Yisrael for Bayis Sheni at the time of Ezra Nehemiah was about 42,000 and change, nothing compared to Bayis Rishon. So it seems paradoxical that the mizbeach in Bayis Sheni should be larger than that of Bayis Rishon. And the Gemara here quotes an answer of Rav Yosef to explain this. The Gemara had previously on Daf Samach Aleph Amud Beis presented a machlokes between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni as to whether or not the Mizbeach was a certain size, depending upon a question about Mizbeach Adama and so forth, with the Eish that came down from Shamayim. Okay, but Rav Yosef now wants to give another answer. Lav Hainu Desanya. Perhaps we could find the answer to that question in a brisa, and this brisa is interpreting a pasuk in Sefer Ezra that says Vayachinu HaMizbeach al Mechonosav, which means that during the Bayis Sheni they established the Mizbeach, and Shehigiu Lisof Midosov. It's interesting that Dafka at the time of Ezra, I guess through Ruach HaKodesh, they knew the Anshe Knesset Gdola, which is made up of 120 Chachmei Yisrael, and they were in charge of Horah Yisrael. They established, and they had three Nevi'im amongst them, Zechariah, Malachi, and Chagai, and they more than understood the exact measurements of the Mizbeach. Now, the truth is that there's a certain maximum size of the Mizbeach that you can't go beyond that. That's going to be Shishim Amma. We'll see that soon. But in terms of exactly what should be the size of the Mizbeach, the dimension of the Mizbeach, that was clear to the Chachmei Anshe Knesset Gdol, but not to Shlomo and his Bezdin. So therefore, Shlomo, because he didn't know exactly what the maximum size of the Mizbeach was, he didn't have that secret that the Anshe Knesset Gdol knew about, that the maximum was 60 Amma. So he therefore kept the Mizbeach down to a minimum so as not to override and violate this maximum size of the Mizbeach, because if he would override it, the Mizbeach would be completely disqualified and impossible. So Rav Yosef says, in this particular answer, and the question is how to reconcile that with his original answer back on the previous Omud about the Eish that came down that would speed up the process of burning up the Karbanos during the course of Shlomo Melech's Bayis Rishon, but in Bayis Sheni there was no Eish Min HaShamayim, and therefore the process of burning up the Karbanos was a very slow process, and there was a backlog of people in the Azor, and therefore they had to expand the size of the Mizbeach. But here, apparently, the Gemara says in a number of places, in Ksubas and elsewhere, that Rav Yosef had amnesia, and he forgot what his original learning was, and Abaye and others tried to jolt his memory and remind him. But in any event, here, he's free from the shackles of his first explanation, because he had already forgotten that, and he came up with a new explanation. So therefore, since at the time of the Anshe Knesset Gdol, they knew that there was room to expand the Mizbeach, therefore they did so, which they weren't aware of at the time of Shlomo Ksiv. Well, what do we do with the pasuk in Divrei Yomi? This is a very, very famous pasuk that's quoted left, right, and center in Kodshim, and especially in Masechta Midos, and also in Zevachim. Hakol b'ksav miyad Hashem olai hiskil. And David HaMelech told Shlomo that Hakol b'ksav, that there's no room for expanding beyond what's in the Ksav. In other words, David HaMelech got a revelation through Nevuah of exactly what the specifications and the sizes and the dimensions of all the kelim in the Beis Hamikdash, and we must follow that ksav, hakol b'ksav. So now the Gemara is raising the following question: how can you say that Shlomo was unaware of that which he was transmitted to him by his own father, David HaMelech? David HaMelech transmitted to him hakol b'ksav. So obviously he knew what would be, the 60 amma allowance for the maximum size of the mizbeach. So if Yosef answers that, you know what, it could be that what was in the ksav that David HaMelech transmitted to Shlomo HaMelech was not always absolutely clear. Sometimes it was beremes. It was only written in a form of an illusion, and therefore you needed Ruach HaKodesh in order to decipher those illusions. Elamar Rav Kra Ashkach V'Darash. Now, who are we referring to here? This is a pasuk in Divrei Yomim, and the question is: are we dealing with drashos of psukim here, or are we dealing with Ruach HaKodesh? The Gemara thought originally that whatever information the Anshe Knesset Gdola had access to during Bayis Sheni, then Shlomo Melech certainly had, with a Kal V'chomer, had access to that information at the time that it was revealed through prophecy by David HaMelech. So if Yosef now comes up with an answer that what the Anshe Knesset Gdola were doing, they weren't operating with Nevuah, not at all. What they did was, although David HaMelech's Nevuah was clear was not clear, but was transmitted to Shlomo HaMelech, and therefore from Shlomo HaMelech down to the Anshe Knesset Gdola time of Ezra, but nevertheless, a lot of what was written in that ksav that was transmitted was illusions. In other words, it was not crystal clear. So Shlomo did not always understand. For example, he didn't know what exactly were the dimensions of the Mizbech, where the Anshe Knesset Gdola knew exactly how to decipher the ksav that was transmitted by David, and they could come up with a meticulous definition of the dimensions of the Mizbech. David zehu beis Hashem Elokim v'zeh Mizbach la'ola liYisrael. So now if you take a look, David mentions in the same pasuk Beis Hashem Elokim, meaning the Beis Hamikdash, and the Mizbeach HaOla, which means the Mizbeach HaChitzoni. So by doing so, he's indicating what's called a hekesh in the pasuk, and it teaches us kibayis, that the Mizbeach should be like the bayis. Wow, these are big dimensions. Ki ma bayis shishim ama af Mizbeach shishim ama. And this is something that Shlomo HaMelech did not know about. He didn't understand the deeper meaning of David's intention here by making this hekesh, and not being aware of the hekesh, he didn't realize that he had a lot of room to expand the Mizbeach, because as long as it didn't go beyond Shishim Amma, it was kosher. And this very much reminds me of a different sugya, not for us now, but about where exactly is the Beis Hamikdash. The Torah only calls it Hamokom Asher Yivchar Hashem. There's no real clear answer to the question, where is the location of the Beis Hamikdash? And this was something that was handed down from one generation to the other through Torah Sheba'al Peh. And very often, the Torah Sheba'al Peh was not publicly known. In any event, getting back to our question, the Gemara is going to ask now, where exactly is the Mizbeach located in the Azara? Bishleim Abayis min Kuratzurasa. El Mizbeach mino yodi. In other words, if you give me an outline, a sketch of where the Beis Hamikdash should be, I could figure out where it's going to be. But in the case of Mizbeach, there was no sketch. There were just words, and you don't know where the in the Beis Hamikdash, where the ksolim, the walls are, and you can figure out where the Beis Hamikdash should be based on the walls. But the Mizbeach didn't really have walls. I mean, it had a Yesod, but you know what? The Yesod was really deep into underground. That's what the Marshal claims. Omer Abulaza Ra'u Mizbeach Banui. So what we're learning now is more of an Agadata that Rabbi Elazar claims that they saw something like a vision up in heaven. And Michal Sarah Gadol Omedu Makraval, and they saw the vision of a heavenly Mizbeach, and none other than Michal, who's considered the Sarah Gadol amongst the Malachim. He's like top banana. And this Michal was standing and bringing karbanos on the Mizbeach. However, there's another opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Omar, Efro Shel Yitzchak Rosh Emunach B'Yosel Mokom. We know that on the site of the Beis Hamikdash, first of all, Adam Arishon brought a carbon, Noach brought a carbon, Avram brought Yitzchak on the Akedah. All this was done on that Mizbeach, the original Mizbeach from the time of Adam Arishon. And what happened was that after Hashem said to Avram through the Malach, he said, Al tishlach yodcha anar, Avram found an ayil, a ram, and he brought the ram on the Mizbeach as a substitute for Yitzchak, and that's called Afro Shel Yitzchak. The ram was burnt on the Mizbeach in place of Yitzchak, and that's considered like the ashes of Yitzchak. And apparently they got a vision of where the ashes of Yitzchak were located. And that's where they knew that the Mizbeach would be. Third opinion, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani Omar, Mikol Abayis Kulo Hericho Reach Torres. This is an amazing piece of Gemara. The Gemara in Yoma tells us that the Torres had such a powerful, beautiful scent, a fragrance, that you could smell it all the way to Yericho from Yerushalayim. And now the Gemara is saying, according to Reb Shmuel, that from the entire bayis, they knew the smell of the Ketores. Now the Ketores was burnt on the Mizbeach HaPnimi. And Misham, Herichu Reach Eivarim. So they not only did they smell the smell of the Ketores, and therefore they could identify the location of the Mizbeach HaPnimi, but they also smelled the aroma of the Eivarim that were brought on the Mizbeach, and they were burnt on the Mizbeach. So again, this was all a supernatural event that took place, and right near the Mizbeach, they could smell the Ki'ilu al Shema Asid, the smell of the roasting Eivarim of the Kodshim that were brought on the Mizbeach, and that's how they were able to identify the location of the Mizbeach. Right? We know that it's Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi were the three Malachim that came to them from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael at the time of what's called Aliyah Shniya, the second Aliyah, to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. One of the three Nevi'im testified about the dimensions of the Mizbech, and another one of the Nevi'im was in charge of identifying the location of the Mizbech. Now, truth be told, this doesn't bother me. A Navi could identify a reality, but the third one is beyond my comprehension. Maybe you'll be able to fill me in. This is a violation of the principle of Ein Navi Rashoy L'Chadish Dover. A Navi has no authority with regard to halachic rulings, and this is a halachic issue about whether the Mizbeach could function as Mizbeach for Karbanos only with the Beis HaMikdash, or even without the Beis HaMikdash. And here, this is actually the halacha today. We could theoretically build a Mizbeach if we get rid of the Arabs there, but and we could actually build a Mizbeach without the bias. Maybe for the bias we need we need a melech, we need a novi, we need Anshe Knesset Agdol, a Bezna Gadol, and so forth and so on. But for a Mizbeach, I'm not sure. I think we could identify the location of the Mizbeach and certainly the size of the Mizbeach. So in any event, I'm just leaving this as an open question. In the Gemara that I have, he doesn't relate to this question at all, but it really bothers my mind. In any event, Masnisa Tana, now we have a brisa. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov Omer, he's one of the great Tanoim. We always paskin like him. He says, Shlosh Neviim Olumam Begal, Echadem Lem Mizbech, Vial Makam Mizbech. So one of the Neviim killed two birds with one stone. He testified not only about the dimensions of the Mizbech, but also about the location of the Mizbech. So then we're going to have one extra Navi. Echad Heid Lehem Shemakim fine. The Echad, the extra Navi here in the calculation of the three musketeers, is Sheheid Lehem Ala Torah Shetikasev Ashuris. Right, there are two types of Ksav for the Sefer Torah. This Ksav Ivri and this Ksav Ashuri. All sorts of different controversies about what was originally the Ksav, but ultimately, clearly, the Ksav was going to be Ksav Ashuri, which is the Ksav that we have in our Sifrei Torah, in our Tefillin, and in our Mezuzahs. And that's part of the reason you pay a lot of money to a sofer. Weiter. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a brisa, Keren v'kevesh v'yesod v'ribua ma'ak. There are four halachas in Mizbeach that are absolutely critical. One is it's got to have four kronos on the top, on the gag shel Mizbeach. Number two, it's got to be a kevesh. We'll soon see that the kevesh actually divide up into subcategories, but one major ramp that led from the bottom, from the Karka Hazar all the way up to the top of the Mizbeach. Finally, you need a Yisod, and that's where they did the Shvicha Shirayim, and you need Ribua. As I remember back in the day, just mentioning very quickly, because I know we were so pressed for time, that we had a shaila about tefillin. We found out that a lot of batim machers were using glue in the tefillin sharash. Now we asked Rav Soloveitchik what his opinion was, and he immediately started quoting the halachas of Mizbeach, because the halacha of tefillin is halacha of ribua, and the original halacha of ribua, that you need an absolute square, a perfect square, is in the Mizbeach. Midas orko, midas rochbo, midas komoso ein ma'akfin. However, the brisa establishes that the measurements of the Mizbeach are not ma'akiv, not the width, nor the height, nor the length. Again, it can't go beyond shishim amma, as we said before, but less than shishim amma, there's like a lot of room for move, for maneuvering it. Minani Mili, how do we know this is so? That you need these four things that are absolutely kuva in the Mizbeach Omer Rav Huna, one by one. Whenever it says HaMizbeach, it's referring to a characteristic of the Mizbeach that's critical. And we find the word HaMizbeach 4 times. And we have it, again, we have to go through all the psukim in Vayikra, Perek Daled, Pasuk Yud Aleph. We have Karnos HaMizbeach referring to the Kronos. And then with regard to the Yesod, it says Yesod HaMizbeach. HaMizbeach means this is essential. And then it says Ravuah HaMizbeach. And finally, you need a kevesh because with regard to the kevesh, it says El Pnei HaMizbeach, which means in front of the Mizbeach. The kevesh, which is the ramp, was in front of the Mizbeach. We'll see exactly where it was located, north, east, south, or west. Elameyato says the Gemara, wait a second. If you're going to tell me that whenever it says ha with a hey ayidiyah, it's absolutely critical, kiar leRebbe v'soviv leRebbe Yossi Rabbi Yehuda hachi nami d'ma'akve. Are you going to tell me that according to Rebbe, with regard to the sovev, right? The sovev is like the ledge around the Mizbeach that allowed the Kohanim to walk around the Mizbeach on that ledge. And now we're going to say that according to Rebbe, because it says HaMizbeach with regard to the sovev, and that's how he interpreted the pasuk, the siv and asato so tachas karkov HaMizbeach milamato. Right, there are a lot of details in this pasuk. Vesanya Ezu Karkov. What is the Karkov, which was on top? and there was something below the Karkov, is Rebbe Omer Zekior, and Rabbi Yosef Rebbe Yehuda Omer Zeh Sovev. So see, again, we have the word Hamizbeach, and we use it with regard to the Karkov. Again, the Karkov is some sort of design around the ledge of the Mizbeach. Is this going to be essential? So Gemara says, why not? Maybe we'll apply this exegetical principle consistently, and whenever it says Hamizbeach, it's Likuva. Tisanya also ayom nifkama keren mizbeach. Okay, if there's a pagam, a damage to the keren mizbeach, clearly the mizbeach is possible. That there's no question about it, and this has to do with the machlokas between the tztukim and the prushim, because the tztukim on Chol Hamoed Sukkos in the midst of Shaftemai B'Sosan of Nisach HaMayim, they had an interpretation that Nisach HaMayim had to be on the ground of the Azorah. And the Torah doesn't spell out exactly how you do the Nisach HaMayim. And so a Kohen was a tztuki. The tztukim penetrated deep into the Migdash Hasheni, very deep. Even amongst the Kohanim Gedolim, there were tztukim. So they didn't have this whole tradition of tztukim. It was all Torah Sheba'al Peh about Nisach HaMayim. So he took the water, this Kohen, and he poured it on the ground. And then they pelted him with esrogim. When they pelted him, which was a nice Maisa Kanos, they actually damaged one of the Kronos. Ve'viu bul shel melach usamuhu. So they filled up this hole, the damage in the keren, with a fistful of salt. So at least on the outside, it would conceal the hole that was in the keren. This was an act that was done out of respect for the Mizbeach. And it's really interesting that on the one hand, respect for the Mizbeach is so fundamental. But on the other hand, the Mizbeach is blamed during the Churban Abayis for downfall, financial downfall of college. But anyway, it's an insult to the Mizbeach that it looks, and it's obvious that it's damaged. Apostle, fine. And Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer Afha Sovev, that since the pasuk says Ha Mizbeach with regard to the Sovev, that's that ledge that goes around the top, therefore that is Likuva according to Rabbi Yossi's interpretation of that pasuk. Tana Rabbanan learned about Karkov. What is this Karkov? Ben Keren lekeren mokom hiluch ragle akonim ama. So I don't understand, but the Gemara seems to assume that if the Kohen had to get from one keren to the other, the 4 kronos, then it was an area that was 1 amma wide, and that served on the top of the Mizbeach as a walkway to allow the Kohanim to go around the Mizbeach. And here you have a diagram of it, the whole thing over here. Karkov means an indentation that encircles something. In this context, signifies a 2 amma wide indentation, that surrounded the site of the Maroch al Gabi Mizbeach. 1 amma of its width lay between the horns. The second amma was used by the Kohen as a walkway. So it's amma as a distance between one keren and the other, and another amma as a walkway for the Kohanim to go around the Maracha, the Eish of the Mizbeach. At the edge of the top of the Mizbeach, there was a narrow rim that was raised slightly above the indented area of the Karkov. Otu Kohanim ben Keren lekeren avi ozli? I don't get it. Why would you need a Karkov, which is a walkway between one keren and the other? You have another amma between one keren and another. The Kohanim didn't walk between one keren and the other. And truth be told, if a coin went from one Karen to the other, how would he get to the next Karen? He's going to hit smack up against the Karen. Ella, Ema, we have to rewrite the Brisa. But Makom Hiluch Ragle Konim Am. So there's a 2 amma wide Kharkov. 1 amma is just the distance between Karen and Karen, and another amma is a walkway for the Kohen to go around the top of the Mizbeach, around the Eish al Gabi Mizbeach, where the Karbonos were Muktarim. So the Gemara now has a problem, because the Brisa seems to indicate that the Kharkov was on top of the Mizbeach. V'aksiv tachas karkuvo milamata ad chetzia. The pasuk describes this beautiful design, this lace, copper lace, that it protruded from the sides of the mizbeach, and it says here tachas karkuvo, which means below the karkuv. So it seemed that the karkuv was on the side of the Mizbeach. It protruded from the side of the Mizbeach. And the copper lattice, which is milamata, it was underneath the karkuv. Omar Nachbar Yitzchak, Trey Hava, there were 2 karkovs. Life is not complicated enough. Chad l'noy v'chad l'kohen v'lo nishtak. One was for a beautiful decoration. That lattice work was on the side of the Mizbeach. And then there was one for the Kohanim to make sure that they didn't slip. And that one was on top of the Mizbeach. So therefore, we have no problem here. The Karkov in the Brisa, which was indented into the upper surface of the Mizbeach, was surrounded by a rim to prevent the Kohanim from falling off. Now it seems here that the whole sugya is dealing with the Mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu, because apparently, according to Rashi and Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, there were no 2 karkovs. There was only 1 karkov, and that was the indented area on top of the Mizbeach. The Kharkov that was originally at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach, that was outside the Mizbeach, was actually replaced by the Soviv, by the ledge. Anyway, it says, Midas Arko, Midas Rachva, Midas Kamosei Ma'akvin, Omer Abmani, Ubilvad Shalo Yafchisenu, Mimizbeach, Sha'asa Moshe. It cannot be smaller than the Mizbeach of Moshe. How small was the Mizbeach of Moshe? Very small. Kama, Omer Rav Nachman, Omer Rav Yosef, Amma. Very funny. This is not a funny joke. It's impossible to tell me that the Mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu was 1 Amma. Machku alei, they started laughing at Rav Yosef. He was a good victim because he, as he said before, he had amnesia. Chamesh amos orech, chamesh amos rochav, ravua yem mizbeach. I mean, how can you tell me it's an amma? I mean, we're talking about 5 ammas in this side, 5 ammas in that side. Abaye said, you know what? I'm going to explain to you what Rav Yosef had in mind. Dilma makom ha'rocha kamarma. What Rav Yosef was talking about is the site of the Eish al Gabi Mizbeach at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Amalei, so when Rav Yosef hears this, he says, Mar de Gavarabu Yotimai Kamina. Abai is such a great man that he knew what I had in mind. I didn't know, but he knew. However, those who mocked him were deserving of a shtach, an azifa, what we call, and Kori Alayu. Here we're going to turn to Amid Beis.